Right, so hello and welcome back to Books and Things, and welcome to a very exciting video. Today I'm going to be talking about my favourite books of 2018. So this is one of my absolute favourite videos of the year to make, and also one of my favourite videos to watch. In fact, I first discovered BookTube properly by watching like a whole huge playlist of people's favourite books of 2014, I want to say, and it's just a video I really love to make. So I have a lot of books to talk about today. Do note I'm not going to be including any rereads in this video. I'm going to be making a separate favourite rereads of 2018 video later on this week. I'm always impressed by the people who have their top 10 books of the year. I find it very hard to narrow down. So I have a top 20 for you. 17 of them are fiction works and 3 of them are non-fiction. So I'm going to start off with the 3 non-fiction ones because I find it quite hard to rank them amongst the rest, and then I will go into my 17 best fiction books of the year. At number 3 of my 3 non-fiction picks, I have The Suspicions of Mr. Witcher by Kate Summerscale. This is a brilliant true crime book which I read during non-fiction November, and it examines the murder of a small boy which took place in 1860 and uses this murder as a kind of case study to explore the rest of Victorian life. I never thought I was someone who would enjoy true crime, but I found this book so compelling and so interesting and so filled with historical detail and historical interest. Like, it was so fascinating to read about not only the murder itself and the kind of solving of the case, but also how Victorian society reacted to it. It's so telling about the way that the Victorian world worked in terms of what was kind of kept behind closed doors, and yeah, just a brilliant, brilliant read that I would highly recommend. Number 2 of my favourite non-fiction books of the year would have to be Jane Austen at Home by Lucy Worsley. Lucy Worsley is a real favourite of mine and an author who I've really enjoyed reading a couple of books by in 2018. She is a fantastic non-fiction author and definitely writes my kind of non-fiction, really informative and interesting, really conversational and readable, but also like full of historical detail. Her biography of Jane Austen is really wonderfully and beautifully written. I know a lot about Jane Austen. I used to work at the Jane Austen Centre in Bath. Like, I knew a fair amount of the information in this, but actually there was still so much new information to learn, and the way Lucy Worsley wrote meant even when I knew things, I still just loved reading her description of Jane Austen's life and about Jane Austen's family and her work. You also get such a sense from that book of how much Lucy Worsley loves Jane Austen, and that just made me very happy. I've read quite a few biographies of Jane Austen, and Lucy Worsley's is definitely the one I would recommend. But my favourite non-fiction book of the year would have to be this, which is What Matters in Jane Austen by John Mullen. I read this back in Jane Austen July, which was a readathon that me and Marissa from Blatantly Bookish hosted earlier on in the year. And this book is just absolutely my kind of literary criticism. The subtitle is 20 Crucial Puzzles Solved, and basically John Mullen takes 20 questions, or 20 like patterns in a way, throughout Jane Austen's work and uses these small details to analyse the whole of her work. So it's often like quite small things that you would think would be quite trivial, such as how much does age matter in her books, and the importance of the seaside, the fact that the lower classes are sometimes invisible, or the significance of characters who don't have any spoken dialogue, or the significance of what the characters read in the books. It's just my kind of literary criticism, full of pattern spotting, but never feeling like it's reading into things too much. It's just spotting little things throughout her work. It's so readable, so enjoyable, like one of the most fun non-fiction books I've ever read. If you love Jane Austen and you've read all her work, this is absolutely a book I would recommend. Literary criticism at its best, really fun, really enjoyable, and yeah, just wonderful. But now, on to my top fiction of 2018. At number 17, I have An Unrestored Woman by Shobha Rao. This is a short story collection that I read quite a while ago now, which I really, really enjoyed. It's very hard-hitting, very moving, very powerful, and just brilliantly done. It is in fact the only short story collection on this list, which is partly due to the fact that I didn't read that many short story collections in 2018, but I love short story collections, and this was brilliant, especially because An Unrestored Woman is a interconnected short story collection, which are absolutely my favourite kind of short story collection. So there are several stories in this, and some of the characters from some stories turn up in other characters' stories. And basically, the short story collection focuses around the division between India and Pakistan. Some of the stories take place around the time that Pakistan and India are being divided, and some of them take place after or before, but all of them kind of look at the treatment of women in the history of India and Pakistan, and it's just brilliant. You just really have to read it. It's very hard-hitting. It deals with a lot of very serious, dark issues, but in a way that is often full of hope. And like the last story in An Unrestored Woman is just beautiful. It just made me cry a bit. And yeah, it's a fantastic collection and one I would highly recommend. At number 16, I have Around the World in 80 Days by Jules Verne. This is a 19th century French novel that I listened to on audiobook with my boyfriend Nick back in September while we were on holiday. It is incredibly good fun. Around the World in 80 Days tells the story of a man who embarks upon a journey to travel around the world in 80 days after a gentleman at his club has bet him that he cannot do it. This man has no interest in seeing the world and no interest in travelling. He just wants to win the bet and play some whist on his way. But by coincidence, on the same day that he leaves London to go on this journey, a certain amount of money goes missing from the bank, and so detectives, thinking that he may have fled London because he has taken the money, start to chase him around the world. It's very good fun, a bit silly, but really engaging, so enjoyable, and also with some surprisingly complex and important themes and some surprisingly enlightened views for the end of the 19th century. Definitely a book I would recommend. At number 15, I have In the Blink of an Eye by Ali Bacon. You will notice that there is quite a lot of historical fiction on this list this year. In the Blink of an Eye is a really wonderful novel. It is set in mid-Victorian Scotland and follows the story of a man who is involved in the development of early photography. The man that this book centres around, D.O. Hill, is a real historical figure. He did exist at the time, but several other of the characters in this book do exist as well. What I really loved about this, aside from like the unusual setting of Victorian Scotland rather than Victorian England and the exploration of early photography, which was really fantastic, what I thought was brilliant about this is the very unusual structure, because although the book kind of centres around D.O. Hill, you never see anything from his perspective, and in fact you see almost everything from the perspective of various different women around him, which is really interesting in terms of the structure because you get to see from a lot of different perspectives, which is, like, I don't know how this book fits so much into such a small book, but also means you get a sense of the involvement of particular women in early photography, which is also really, really interesting. It's definitely a book I would recommend. I actually did my creative writing masters a few years ago with Ali, and I read some extracts of this at the time and loved it then, and I love it now. It's a really brilliant book and I would highly recommend it if you enjoy historical fiction. Talking of the Victorian period, at number 14 I have Tipping the Velvet by Sarah Waters. This is another fantastic historical fiction, one I really enjoyed. This is my second Sarah Waters and I liked it more than Fingersmith, which was my first, though I did love Fingersmith a lot as well. This tells the story of a young woman called Nan. At the beginning of the book we meet her when she is living in Whitstable. Nan develops a crush on a woman who performs at the local music hall, and this crush and kind of friendship with this woman Kitty kind of leads Nan into an entirely new life. We follow Nan from Whitstable to London into a lot of very, very different situations. The way this book looks at sexuality and gender in the Victorian period is absolutely fascinating, really, really interesting. And I also just love like this coming of age story element of this. Like, you know, we follow Nan in her late teens, early 20s and get to discover more about her as she discovers more about herself. There's also a wonderful love story in this, some brilliant things about Victorian music hall culture. It's a really, really brilliant, engaging read. I love Sarah Waters a lot and I would highly recommend this one. From neo-Victorian literature to actual Victorian literature, next at number 13 is East Lynne by Ellen Wood. This is a Victorian novel which I read for Victober and one that I really enjoyed. Ellen Wood is not an author I had ever encountered before and I definitely want to read more by her in the future. East Lynne is very complicated and has a long and detailed plot, and it's hard for me to tell you about it without spoiling things, but within the first few chapters there is bankruptcy and murder, and later on there are all kinds of Victorian scandals. It is a Victorian sensation novel, but it also deals with a lot of really complicated themes and it has a lot of really well-drawn characters and looks really interestingly at the position of women within Victorian society. It's a really great read, so gripping, so enjoyable. If you want a Victorian page-turner, this is definitely one I would recommend. At number 12 I have And Then There Were None by Agatha Christie. Agatha Christie is an author I have loved discovering in the last 2 years, and Then There Were None is definitely my favourite Agatha Christie so far. It is one of her standalone novels and it begins with 10 different people being summoned to an island off the coast. These 10 people have all been brought together in slightly mysterious circumstances. When they get there they find that they are the only 10 people on this island, and then a gramophone recording starts which accuses them all of being responsible for various deaths. And then slowly, one by one, these people start to get picked off. It is so dramatic, the atmosphere is just incredible, but it's also, like all Christie, really just enjoyable to read. Like, you can get through it so quickly. I think as well, Agatha Christie is just a master of like characterization and just really getting to grips with a character in just like 1 or 2 lines. I think she's just fantastic and I loved And Then There Were None a lot. At number 11 I have Can You Forgive Her by Anthony Trollope, another Victorian novel. This is the first book in Anthony Trollope's The Palliser series, and I loved it a lot. Anthony Trollope is one of my favourite Victorian authors and this was just a really wonderful read. It tells the story of a young woman called Alice, and at the beginning of the book she's engaged but she's not really sure whether or not she wants to keep the engagement. She's very fond of the man she is engaged with, but she feels that he is a bit better than her, that she might not be worthy of him, and also that the life he wants to lead is not perhaps the life she wants to lead. And then there is also her cousin George, who she used to be engaged with, who starts hanging around her again. It's very dramatic, very exciting, really enjoyable and interesting. I love Anthony Trollope's writing style. I feel like there are a few authors whose work I just like enjoy every single word of as Anthony Trollope. Like, not just the whole book is great, but just like every chapter I'm just having such a great time reading. The Lady Glencora, Mr. Palliser plotline in this was just fantastic and so brilliantly done, and just shows like no one writes about bad marriage like Anthony Trollope. So yeah, I would highly recommend Can You Forgive Her? Although I would recommend reading the Barsetshire Chronicles before the Palliser novels, because you meet Mr. Palliser in one of the Barsetshire Chronicles. At number 10, I have Days Without End by Sebastian Barry. I mentioned earlier that there is a lot of historical fiction on this list. I realised actually as well, specifically, there is a lot of historical fiction on this list which deals with LGBTQ+ themes and characters, which is something I always really love in historical fiction, especially in historical fiction set in the 19th century, because I love reading books written in the 19th century. So if I read a contemporary book set in the 19th century, I wanted to bring something different to the book that books written in the 19th century don't bring to it. Days Without End is set in 1850s America, and we follow two men, Thomas and John. We follow their lives as soldiers fighting in the Indian Wars and the Civil Wars. We also follow them as lovers and as a family, as they adopt a Native American girl and kind of form a family of their own, always of course having to keep their relationship a secret. This book is just so beautiful and writes so beautifully about family and relationships in such a wonderful way. I also just love like the narrative voice of this is so rich and feels so authentic. I thought it was such a brilliant read, and I loved it. I read it in just one day, I think, and it was just an absolutely incredible book. I would highly recommend this, and I'm very excited to read more by Sebastian Barry in the future. At number 9, I have Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier. This was my first Daphne du Maurier. I've since also read My Cousin Rachel, which I also really enjoyed, but Rebecca is definitely my favourite so far. It's a really atmospheric and powerful read, and I found it so interesting. I can't believe it took me so long to get to her work. In Rebecca, we follow an unnamed narrator. She, while travelling abroad as a companion to an elderly woman, meets a man called Maxim de Winter, with whom she falls quite quickly in love. Maxim is quite a lot older than her, but they get married, and he takes her back to his grand estate in England, where she discovers that his old life is kind of haunted by his first wife, Rebecca, who died about a year before in a tragic accident. And everything kind of goes on from there. It is so exciting, so well done, so clever, so atmospheric, the writing's so incredible, and I also found it really interesting to compare to Jane Eyre, and I made a video about the relationship between Rebecca and Jane Eyre, which I'm going to link down below. Such an interesting book, one I would highly recommend. At number 8, I have A Place Called Winter by Patrick Gale, another brilliant queer historical fiction novel. A Place Called Winter tells the story of Harry Kane, who is forced to leave his family behind in Edwardian England when rumours start to circulate about his sexuality. He travels to Canada to a place called Winter, and we follow his life and his story there. This is such an incredible historical novel, so exciting and interesting. I knew very little about the history of Canada in the very early 20th century, and I found that kind of settler life, with a slight difference from a lot of the 19th century American settler novels, really interesting. While in Canada, Harry meets a brother and sister who he forms a close bond with, and I found the relationship between Harry and both the brother and the sister just so nice and so brilliantly done. Like, it's such a moving, brilliant book. So historically fascinating, but also at its heart just like a wonderful love story. It's great, and I cannot recommend it enough. At number 7, I have Everything I Never Told You by Celeste Ng. This was a real surprise to me. I picked it up for a book club, having heard lots about it, but not really feeling very sure whether or not I would like it, and I just fell in love with Celeste Ng's writing style. It really reminded me of Emily St. John Mandel, who is my favourite contemporary novelist, probably, almost definitely. It was just really brilliantly written. Everything I Never Told You tells the story of a family and what happens when the teenage daughter of that family goes missing, and everything that kind of goes on from there. It looks kind of back into the past and the relationship between Lydia and her parents and her brother and sister, and also kind of looks at the present as they work out what has happened to Lydia. The exploration of life in 1970s America was brilliant, and one of the things I thought was especially brilliantly done about Everything I Never Told You was its look at kind of racism in small towns. Lydia's mother is white and Lydia's father is Chinese American. The book really powerfully looks at how that affects how people treat her disappearance. It's such a brilliant book, so well written, and I can't recommend it enough. I really need to read her second novel. At number 6, I have Mrs. Gaskell and Me by Nell Stevens. This is a wonderful book which Picador very kindly sent me for review, and I just fell in love with it completely. It is a dual narrative which switches between the present and the past in the Victorian period. In the present, we follow a young woman called Nell who is doing a PhD on English literature / art, specifically focusing on Elizabeth Gaskell and various writers and artists who she met one summer in Rome. And we also follow Nell's long-distance relationship with a man who is from America, sometimes living in Paris, sometimes living in America, while Nell is living in London. And then we also slip back into the Victorian period where we follow Elizabeth Gaskell, one of my favourite novelists, and her relationship with a young man who she met in Rome and kind of formed a close friendship with. It's so brilliant. Last week I mentioned this in my December wrap-up and said that there are a few books that have made me cry as much as this book did. Not because this book was incredibly sad, but just because it really, really moved me, because it's really powerful and engaging, and the way Nell Stephens writes about the love of books and connection with books is just wonderful. And I just found it incredibly moving and incredibly poignant. Both the chapters about Elizabeth Gaskell, which made me want to know so much more about Gaskell's life. You know, she's one of my favourite authors, but I don't know that much about her life. And also the Nell chapters in the present were really, really compelling and interesting. Not just in terms of Nell writing her PhD and kind of struggling with this long-distance relationship, but also the kind of other issues that she's dealing with in her life and kind of worries about wanting to have children and not knowing what kind of life path to follow. It's just fantastic, and I can't recommend it enough. If you like Elizabeth Gaskell especially, but you don't have to, like, I still feel like you get so much out of this, and I just adored it. And if anyone can recommend me anything like this, like, I want to read so many more books like this. This is fantastic, guys. You really, really must read it. It was so good. It was great. At number 5, I have The Miniaturist by Jessie Burton. This I read way back in January 2018 and just absolutely loved it. It's really very much my kind of historical fiction. It is set in the Netherlands in the 17th century. We follow a young woman called Petronella. At the beginning of the book, Petronella gets married, but she finds her marriage not exactly what she wanted it to be. Her husband seems to have no interest in her. She doesn't get on well with her new sister-in-law. The book has a small magical element, but I feel like that's something that gets talked about a lot, whereas actually that's not what most of this book is. There is a little bit of magic, and I really enjoyed that little bit of magic, but for the most part this is just a really interesting historical fiction novel, very much character and kind of issue focused, and it's just the way this book looks at this particular historical time period and the way it looks at the relationships between all the characters and the twists and turns of this book that I did not see coming. It's just fantastic. I loved it a lot. At number 4, I have Radiance by Catherine M. Valente. I was about to say that this was the only contemporary book on this list that doesn't have some historical elements, but it does in some ways have some historical elements, so I guess I just had a very historical year. It's not very historical though. It is a sci-fi space opera book about films, told through film scripts and other methods of unusual structures. It is fantastic, and I really don't know how she did it, because this book shouldn't work. Like, there is so much in this book and it's so complicated, but somehow Catherine M. Valente pulls it off magnificently, and it is incredible. I did a full review of this at the time, which I'm going to link down below. The book is set in the 1930s to 60s, but in space, because people are in space at this point, and also Hollywood is on the moon. Isn't that just awesome to begin with? In this book we find out that a young woman called Severin Unk, who is the daughter of a famous film director and who was a film director herself, has gone missing. And this book kind of pieces together her life and what might have led to her disappearance and what happened on Venus where she vanished. But it's all told through diary entries and film scripts, and just through this unusual structure, which means you're always viewing everything at several removes distance. But somehow this like film scrapbook of 1950s Hollywood on the moon comes together to present this amazing story and these amazing characters. It's so clever, it's so brilliant, I would highly recommend it. Now, my final 3 are all fantastic, and I feel like I could have picked any of those 3 to be my top book of the year. So the final 3, the ranking is a little bit arbitrary because they're all incredible, but at number 3, we're going to have Maurice by Ian Forster. This is a brilliant book that I'm so glad I finally got around to reading, and I know now I must read more Ian Forster. I read Howard's End at university several years ago, I guess like 5 years ago now, but it's taken me several years to pick up more by him. But I read Maurice finally this year after watching a brilliant review of it by Libby Stevenson, whose channel I'll link down below, and I just thought it was incredible. Ian Forster wrote Maurice in the 1910s, but it wasn't published until after his death in 1970. Ian Forster himself was gay, and this is the only one of his many novels that explicitly deals with homosexuality. Maurice tells the story of a young man called Maurice who realises as a fairly young man that he is gay, who forms a relationship with a man who struggles with his sexuality, the way society perceives it, and the fact that he is in many ways an outsider from society, and that his relationships with men will never be accepted by society, and he feels for a lot of the book that there is something wrong with him that he wants to try and fix. It's incredibly powerful and incredibly moving, and it is just fantastic. As someone who is very interested in cultural and social history, this is just fascinating and such a important and interesting book. But leaving that aside, it is also just a really compelling coming-of-age story and a really beautiful love story, and so well done. And Maurice is such an interesting character because he's not always likeable, he's a bit sexist, he's a bit of a snob, he's a bit selfish, but also you understand why, and you get such a strong sense of his personality and of his, like, difficulties in life, and it's just wonderful. I think it's fantastic, and I would highly, highly urge that everybody read it. At number 2, I have Olive by Diana Mulock-Crape. This is a Victorian novel that I read for Victober, and it was incredible. Definitely one of my best, like, underrated, obscure, random Victorian literature discoveries. I just thought it was amazing and fantastic, and I would highly recommend it, especially if you like Jane Eyre. I think it has quite a lot in common with Jane Eyre, so I would highly recommend it on that grounds. Olive follows a character called Olive from her birth up until her kind of late 20s, I think, and we go through her life and her childhood into her adulthood, following her family relationships, her career, her relationships with men, and so on. In the first chapter, when Olive is born, we learn that she is born with some fault in her spine, which means she grows up with a physical deformity, and the book looks really fascinatingly and really movingly at how society, and especially how her family, treat Olive because of her physical deformity, and how that kind of shapes her growing up in life. I made a video back in Victober on the presentation of characters with physical deformities and disabilities back in Victober, which I'm going to link down below, and I talked about Olive quite a lot there. I talked about Olive quite a lot in Victober as well, but Olive was one of the books I read kind of specifically in order to make that. But I found in it not just like a really interesting book in terms of looking at disability and disformity in the Victorian period, but also just like a incredibly powerful, moving novel. So interesting in terms of the presentation of deformity and disability, but also so interesting in terms of gender and religion and class and like family dynamics and so many other things. And it reminded me in Jane Eyre in a lot of ways, because it follows a woman who is not conventionally beautiful, who sees herself as being outside of society, who feels she deserves happiness and like claims happiness, and it's just so great. I'm getting very emotional now, guys. Another thing I loved is that Olive also kind of becomes an artist, and the book kind of follows her career and her independence, and she's just a fantastic character. It's a wonderful, wonderful read, a brilliant plot, so moving, so powerful, and just, yeah, I think everyone should read Olive. It's a really, really brilliant book. I think it's pretty hard to get your hands on, but because it's out of copyright, you can get a free copy on ebook, and it's really worth your time, guys. It's very much worth your time. But at number 1, probably, I'm going to place The Watchmaker of Filigree Street by Natasha Pulley. I read this back in April and absolutely fell in love with it. I read it in one day, and it's definitely a new lifetime favourite for me. Absolutely 100% my kind of historical fiction. The kind where you read a book and you're like, ah, this book was written for me. Not specifically, but also a little bit. So it is set in Victorian London in the 1880s, and it follows a young man called Nathaniel. Nathaniel is working in the civil service. I've mentioned before I have a random obsession with the Victorian civil service. He lives a fairly ordinary, mundane life, but one day he gets home from work to find a pocket watch on his bed, and he has no idea how this pocket watch has got there. But Nathaniel tracks down the maker of this watch to find out why it's been given to him, and he comes across a Japanese clockmaker called Keita Mori, who is living in London, who is the maker of the watch, and then everything goes on from there. It's just incredible. It's got like all of the things that I love in a novel. It's got a dual narrative, it's got music as an important theme, it's set in the Victorian period, but because half the characters are Japanese, it looks at quite different groups of Victorian society than you often encounter in historical fiction and in Victorian literature itself. It's got a little bit of magic, not too much, just enough to like make the book even more powerful, but never like enough to distract from everything else. And it looks really wonderfully at like Victorian social morals and codes. Like, it's such a brilliant study of Victorian life. You can tell that Natasha Pulley knows her stuff, and I love this a lot. I thought it was incredible, and I would highly, highly recommend it. If you like historical fiction, even if you don't, you gotta pick this up, guys. I thought it was absolutely, absolutely wonderful. So there we have it. That was probably quite a long video. Those are my favourite 20 books of the year. It was a good reading year in 2018. I read a lot of books and a lot of really brilliant ones, and a lot of new favourites, I think, that I hope to reread again in future. So thank you so much for watching. Please let me know down in the comments if you've read any of the books I've spoken about and what you thought of them, and also let me know what your favourite book of 2018 was. And I'll be back very soon with another bookish video.